Yes.
I think we can. All good. Yeah. Great. Welcome everyone to this Friday's seminar. And before I introduce our speaker, I know there's a few new faces, so I'll just introduce these series. These are seminars on nature that we hold every Friday at this time in this place pretty regularly. And so if you want to be on the mailing list, just go to our website, Oxford Nature Seminar Series, and you can see how to join on the mailing list if you want to be more regularly updated. And we have just to highlight the next few weeks of speakers. Next week we've got Lee White, who's a leading conservationist who was in Gabon, and is telling about his journey from growing up in Africa through to becoming Minister for Forests in Gabon and leading and representing African forest conservation, to as reflecting on that. And that's the Orphan Chimpanzee's Brother, Who Speaks for Nature. That's next Friday at 4:15. The week after, we've got Professor Kate Jones from UCL talking about artificial intelligence for nature recovery. And the week after, we've got the writer Guy Shrubsole talking about Ill Fares the Land, holding large landowners to account for nature destruction and restoration. And then the last week, we've got Professor Dom Spracklen from Leeds on Do Forests Make It Rain, harnessing the local climate benefits of tropical forests. So quite an interesting scope and range of talks there. So do come along. And then it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Ian Mell, who's Professor in Environmental and Landscape Planning at Manchester and Head of Department currently of Planning, Property and Environmental Management at that place. And he works, as you'll see, on urban greening, green infrastructure, and how planning policy can support equitable, sustainable green cities, and holds a bachelor's in geography and environmental management, and has a PhD in architecture, planning and landscape from Newcastle. And it's wonderful to welcome you here. Afterwards, we'll have some questions, but then also we have a drinks reception around the corner that you're all welcome to come along and have a more informal conversation as well. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for Wendy for the invitation, and for everyone to be here. If we were in Manchester, this room would be empty. None of our staff or students would be here on a Friday afternoon at 4:15. They'd have gone home. So thank you. I also feel like an absolute imposter now, given the list of people you've got coming, like conservationists, nature recovery, tree folks. Like, yeah, I'm a planner. I'm a geographer by trade, as we all are, but I'm a planner by profession. And I kind of fell into green infrastructure. I wanted to be a development studies person. I wanted to go and work in Southeast Asia. No jobs. I'm not an anthropologist. I'm not an economist. I'm not a water person. Went back and did planning. And what I found interesting about planning is that all those ideas about sustainability, about people and nature relationships, about how we think about things strategically and then locally, it's planning in a nutshell. And a lot of the things that we talk about as planning, we've been doing for 200 years. We've been doing it through Ebenezer Howard, through Frederick Law Olmsted. And this is just the latest wheeze, really, the latest idea, the latest terminology that we're using. So when Wendy asked me if I wanted to do this, I was like, yeah, cool, Oxford. Who's going to say no to Oxford? And in fact, I'm quite worried because I used to live in the other place. And I used to work in East Cambridgeshire. So I got used to that other place and how they deal with it. And I was like, oh, okay, Oxford's a bit different. But I'm going to talk about two things, because Wendy asked me to kind of dovetail something. And one is about the evolution of ideas around green infrastructure and its policy, and those ideas in England, particularly in England, because I think there's an incredibly strong story about that from about 2006 onwards, and probably going back to 1991 with the formation of the community forest partnerships. But then to think about these ideas in an international perspective, and particularly in an East and Southeast Asian perspective. And the reason for that is that I like going to places. I like traveling. I'm probably one of the worst people for carbon emissions in the University of Manchester, me and the president. And I've always been fascinated by East Asia because the food is amazing, the landscape architecture is amazing, and just the pace of change is so astonishing, particularly in China, that it's interesting to understand it and try and break it down. So I am one of those global academic tourists who goes and goes to other places and sort of hooks up with folks in Hong Kong and in China and ends up being able to write a book about him called Growing Green Infrastructure in Contemporary Asian Cities. And that book is kind of an endpoint to 10 years of thinking about these ideas, because we can talk about these in the UK, we can talk about them in a European or a North American context, but there's an increasing literature specifically in China, but across South and East Asia, asking very, very important questions about resilient futures, around sustainability, around livability, and the ways in which we have to think differently about how we develop our cities, how we manage nature and environmental systems, but not to throw away all the knowledge that we already have. And I think that's the key issue, that in the UK, we always look back to Ebenezer Howard and Garden Cities and think forward from there. The new towns and the new nature towns, the latest articulation. But in China or in Japan, as we'll come to later on, we're looking at very particular understandings of place, linked to landscape architecture, linked to a historical understanding of sky, water, mountain, building, people. And it's been extensively looked at. But if you move those ideas forward by a few millennia into where we are now, those things help us to talk about climate change. We're talking about urban form, urban structure. We're talking about people and that relationship with nature. And I think that's where I'm coming from. So this link from the UK to Asia, it might seem a bit tenuous to start with, but it will get there. And for those who don't know about green infrastructure, it is the finest concept in the world. You can take your nature-based solutions and your nature recovery and GI all the way. And I know that's not very popular. I have colleagues who are nature recovery folks, and there's all about bears and beavers, and at least one person in the room has been taught by me and one of my colleagues, so knows who I'm talking about. But I think, though, if we look at green infrastructure as something which is, as Clive Davies would say, old wine in new bottles, something that we've known about for generations. And we're just reconfiguring it for the policy and the planning debates that we have now in 2026. But there are things that we can go back to and rely on to really structure these conversations. We're always looking at change over time, so temporality. We're always looking at geographical variations. Our students love to compare and contrast. China and England, it's not the same, it's too big. So we're looking at how ideas travel and how they move. We're looking at issues of scale, particularly in ecology or water management. We're not looking at a single site. We're looking at how things move over time and space and how we can manage that effectively. And I think really importantly, we're looking at disciplinary differences. And so your range of speakers is amazing because you're hearing from very different perspectives. But how do you talk to a water engineer if you're a tree person? How do you talk to a hardcore deep ecologist if you're a planner? The language is different. The phrasing is different. The ideas are different. And I think green infrastructure gives us some of that common ground to talk about, because it allows us to talk about multiple functions or benefits in a single location. It allows us to think about that connectivity between people and place and between habitats across different scales. It allows us to consider how we as individuals access nature and what we benefit from, and how those who are disenfranchised can be afforded more access. And we think about it in a more holistic manner in terms of how do we try and balance the environment and the need to support environmental systems with the need to support the economy. And in the middle is people and how people react to both of those things. So there's an ongoing circular conversation about people, place, environment, or within a bigger bubble, which is the politics of this, and the politics of planning, and the politics of the environment, and the politics of economic growth. So a lot of the discussions around GI can relate to these simple principles: multifunctionality, connectivity, access to nature, and integrated or strategic planning. But we can also think about it as a technical approach to planning, thinking more about engineers or water management, or more of a social and a cultural perspective. There's an image later on from China, which is my favorite picture I've ever taken. And it's very much about that everyday tactile relationship people have with nature. So there's lots of ways to articulate this. One of the other ways, and the most simplistic ways, is to break it down into a series of elements. What is it? Trees, grass, parks, waterways, green walls, green roofs. The list is quite extensive. And one of the reasons I always go trees and parks and grass, when I started my PhD in 2005, I went home for Christmas and we're having Christmas dinner. And my mum says to me, "What are you actually doing?" My mum's not really the academic type. She's like, "You're wasting your time, get a real job." And I explained it in this really technical first year PhD student way. "I'm really clever, I'm fancy." And she went, "What?" So I was like, "It's trees and grass and stuff." And she went, "Like my garden?" I was like, "Yes, like your garden." And so we broke it down into elements. And I think that's part of the nature of what I'm going to talk about, that ease of just finding that common ground and thinking about if it's about how people understand parks or street trees or waterways or green walls, there's a way that we can talk about green infrastructure. And that allows us to use these ideas across the world. And because of that, and if we look at the literature, it is astounding how many new phrases come up. So the whole blue-green infrastructure, green-blue infrastructure, urban green infrastructure, rural green infrastructure, every academic, including those in this room, want to have their title. And nature-based solutions was the latest one, the big European push for it, but seems to have kind of pulled back a little bit, still very European. But if you're looking across things like water, for example, and you're talking about combined stormwater overflow, or low impact development, or water sensitive urban design, or sponge cities, they are fundamentally all the same thing. They're all drawing from a need to manage water more effectively. It's just that they're geographically bespoke. And so one of the things I want to argue is that green infrastructure offers an opportunity to break down some of these barriers between language, terminology, and application. Because GI, in its sense, is quite aspatial. Its principles are aspatial. And therefore, it allows people to go, "Oh, that particular idea fits within low impact development. That particular idea fits with water sensitive urban design. Therefore, an Australian can talk to an American and have a conversation about water." And I think that works with a whole series of different ideas like urban forestry and community forestry. Urban forestry might have a larger scale, being from North America and Canada specifically, whereas community forestry might be more localized in the UK, particularly in the north of the country. We might look at the Sustainable Cities Agenda from 2004 and the Office of Deputy Prime Minister under New Labour, and just think it's just Howard's Garden Cities all over again, but on a slightly different configuration. And so what I really like about working in this space is that all these things talk to each other. And it's just finding the thing that we like, or the thing that really goes, "Oh, that's the thing that I can get along with." And I think that's why when we think about these ideas outside of a European context, again, we're looking at, is it green space? Is it GI? Is it nature-based solutions that's really targeting politicians or money or development? And I think that allows us to then bring in a whole series of other ideas. And that comes to things like this, where you talk about sponge cities in China, everybody instantly knows what you're talking about. But if you talk about green infrastructure in India, people go, "What do you mean?" Because they're talking about green space. Up until recently in Germany, green space planning was the de facto language. Only recently, because of nature-based solutions, really, have they started to talk about green infrastructure. So it's kind of going through some of those traditional understandings and making it more open to interpretation. And then you get places like the US, where it's a bit of everything, and particularly combined stormwater overflow, low impacted development. It's the same thing, really, just slightly different configuration. But when we're looking at the international literature, I think this is important, because if we're talking about nature-based solutions in Thailand or in Indonesia or in Malaysia, what's the background context of that? What are the principles? What are the policy hooks? What are the financial mechanisms being used to that? And if they're the same as for sponge cities in China or community forestry in the UK, then the ideas behind GI can be transferred across in a relatively straightforward manner, because again, they're not spatially confined. And again, I think these are things that are worth teasing out of the literature, because we can get bogged down in this term works everywhere, but actually it's the contextual understanding of it which I think is more important. Which brings us to the UK and specifically England. So England and its policy is an interesting case study to work with. I've been working in planning for 20 years. I've seen, I can't remember how many planning ministers. I've seen so many re-articulations of the National Planning Policy Framework recently. I forget which one we're on. But what I do think we see in the UK, and particularly England, is a very particular roller coaster ride of pro-environmental, pro-development characteristics. So New Labour, 2004, sustainable communities, one of the high points of thinking about bringing nature back into cities under the New Labour administration. Walkability, livability, greening, water management, climate change, all together. I think often underrepresented in current conversations. Then at the end of that administration, we got the coalition, then the Conservatives, and we got the National Planning Policy Framework, which I'm going to be very, very mean about. They took 1,000 pages of legislation and made it into, I think it was 63 pages. They took all the detail, all the structure, all the ability to map on green space or health or water or minerals to very particular parts of planning and actions and chucked it in the bin because they wanted a more deregulated and open to conversation type policy. And to many, including me, it was really detrimental because all that certainty about how you manage nature and biodiversity and water got removed. And we went back to we should do things. And where all academics or students, you should do your reading. You should come to a meeting. We all find reasons not to do things. And if you're a developer, you can certainly find reasons not to comply with planning policy. So I think 2011, 2012 was a bit of an nadir for British planning. But then 2018, we get the 25-year environment plan. And I'm really conflicted by this plan. Michael Gove, not a big fan, but a really prominent forward-looking piece of policy saying we need a national GI standard. We need to talk about biodiversity net gain. We need to think about nature recovery. All those things that we're now talking about were referenced in this document. And I think, again, we're back on the upwards trajectory. We're thinking government gets what we're talking about. Then we get 2020, the Planning for the Future white paper, and it went back down to houses, 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 and the glorious word of beauty. We want beautiful places. Now, my wife is an art historian. She deals in subjectivity. She deals in nuance. And I'm a planner and I like facts. And so what is beautiful? Oxford is beautiful, but some people will hate the architecture. Manchester is beautiful. I hate the architecture, particularly the 1960s building that I work in. But it's such an area where there isn't an answer. So how can you plan for beauty if no one knows what beauty is? The same argument for how do you plan for environmental quality unless you have a number or a set of metrics to work with it. And so we have this 15-year period where things are going up and down. And then we have the constant revisions to the NPPF. And this is a bit of a note of caution. If you're ever going to use AI to do policy analysis, check it afterwards. And the reason I say that is because I check the NPPF regularly for updates. And I know how many times GI is referenced and what it says, because I've read it. I actually read the whole thing. AI gives me a different number. So just check it. But GI is in the National Planning Policy Framework. It's there saying we should follow the National GI Standard. Brilliant. There are 6 references. They're all like that. It doesn't really tell you anything. So does it fill you with a real compunction to do these things? Or do you think I probably should think about it? And this is, again, it's our national guidance. So the NPPF, I would argue, is not really fit for purpose. But if we look across the UK, I think this is where, when I'm talking about England, I'm trying to exclude Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, because they do things differently, is that England seems to be lagging behind, despite being at the forefront of these conversations for so long, and being at the forefront of the evidence gathering and the policy making. The Welsh Government, in their planning policy for Wales Edition 12, doesn't have a GI policy, but very clearly says, you have to do this, and here's how. The Scottish government policy, so the National Planning Framework 4, has an actual blue and green infrastructure policy which sets out what you should do. Even in the Republic of Ireland, it has 2 national objectives about what we should do. Northern Ireland's a bit of a basket case with their policy. It's getting better, but it's still not quite there. And then England, it's like, yeah, MPPF, GI. And so for a country which is leading the ideas academically, practically in policy, it's not really embedded within the national planning structures. And so I think England is really lagging behind, despite setting the agenda on a lot of these ideas. And that's made it even more annoying when we think about the way in which legislation has been developed to purposefully ensure that nature recovery, biodiversity, GI is in planning. The Environment Act made it clear BNG, the National GI Framework, were going to happen and we have to follow them. Absolutely fantastic. It gives certainty to planners that this has to happen. It gives certainty to developers that they have to adhere to this. The National GI Standard. For transparency, I wrote quite a lot of it. Some of it I'm quite proud of. Other bits I'm like, maybe not so much. I don't think it works collectively. It's like 4 bits stuck together. I think the design code is good. The tree canopy stuff is good. The urban greening factor is good. The accessibility stuff is fantastic. That's my stuff. But it kind of is bits and it's kind of hard to put it all together. But it's something that we have to use and it's legally mandated to use it, which is fantastic. And then we have BNG. Whatever our theories or thoughts or opinions on BNG, we have BNG and it's better than where we were. How do we deliver it? How do we manage it? How do we manage that 30-year time period? Everyone's finding out at the same time. I think today is the 2nd anniversary of its launch, isn't it? So happy birthday, BNG. But it's something that is really, really hard. It's there. It's something concrete. Bad analogy, but it's something that we have to use. So we have this suite of supporting policy and legislation, but it doesn't necessarily map onto what we have at a national level, which causes some conflicts. And so we have to think quite carefully about, are we going to deliver on these things in an effective way? If part of the structure is really, really supportive and part of it is kind of lacking in credibility or certainty. And just to add one further problem to this whole mix, it's the notion of funding and financing. Because having a policy is brilliant, having legislation is brilliant, but if you've then got a conversation about who pays for it, who maintains it, who benefits from it, I think we then have to talk quite carefully about a bigger issue of public funding through central to local government, through their core grants. We have to look at the ways in which the planning structures of Section 106 and planning obligations, urban greening factors and BNG can support investment in nature. But we also need to look at other people as well. So the private sector and that growing understanding of corporate social responsibility and the way in which businesses are buying into carbon credits, green financing, green bonds. And is it actually helping or is it sort of pushing the arguments to a different place? And what I think is important here is that we've relied for too long on almost a single point of financing, central government. We've used the planning system to try and leverage funds from developers, but it's always been like the secondary funding rather than the primary one. And this has to change. We went through over a decade of austerity with the Tory and the coalition government, and it really did gut local government. It gutted their planning departments, their landscape and their maintenance teams, and it left them vulnerable to challenge, particularly around development for housing, and particularly around development for housing in rural areas or greenbelt areas. And so thinking about funding, thinking about financing as a multi-stakeholder conversation, I think is part of the way forward, because everybody needs to take some responsibility because everybody benefits. And we'll come back to that idea in a moment. And so just to have a bit of a whirlwind stop of GI in the UK, I think over a 20-year period, GI has been legitimised in political thinking. It's had its ups and downs, but it has remained. It's still there. It's embedded greater appropriateness in design, understanding of social, economic, and ecological alignment through the National GI Standard and the Green Infrastructure Design Code. And there's a massively robust evidence base that is supporting decision making through Natural England and through other companies as well. And I think what's happened because of this constant dialogue over 20 years is that we've seen a greater level of transparency in terms of how decisions are made. I'm aware that if you ever read a local paper or the national news and it's talking about green space, either it's terrible because we've sold it all, or it's great because people are having a nice time in the sunshine, and then they leave litter and everyone hates it. But the conversations are then they're backed by a level of transparency. But what we also see is because we have this 20-year time frame, because it's built on a lot of very clear evidence from the 1800s onwards, that these ideas transfer, they move. They're able to be applicable in England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, as they are in France, Germany, and further afield into Asia. And yes, the local context is always different, but the context can work because the principles are spatial, the elements are a suite, a palette of different options, and the thinking works between disciplines. And I think that's where GI has been incredibly successful. And so moving on from this strategic thinking and policy to action, I think we can start to kind of put these things on axes and think about, are we talking about nature-centric development? Or are we talking about people? Are we talking about quantitative analysis and metrics? So back to Wendy and other people in your centre. Are we thinking about those socio-cultural experiences, the kind of place where I sit? And I think it's not an either or. It's a combination of all these things. And we could all situate ourselves somewhere across this axis. I'm probably somewhere over in this bottom right-hand corner. I suspect some of you are in the top left, depending on what you're interested in. But I think it's really important to have these conversations because it allows us to think about that link, that relationship between people and nature, between technology and society, and between the use of data and evidence and robust quantitative techniques versus experience. And I think that experience is really key. Because if we're looking at green infrastructure from a number of different perspectives, we can mainstream it through a set of principles, a set of elements, and as a space that's an ecological asset, things that the mainstream literature talks about. But we can also theorize GI as a political issue, as a place where political power and authority is shown. It can be a catalyst for economic development, and we'll come back to that in Asian examples in a little while. And of course, it can be an abstract. It can be an assemblage of what's gone before versus what the future might hold. It can be an object or a cultural monument. Every year we take our GI students to Berlin for a field trip, and we take them to Treptower Park, where it has the Russian War Memorial. And we're talking about those issues of cultural monument in a space which doesn't necessarily feel right. And that monument to death and to power versus the wider use of the park as a general park. So there's lots of different ways we can start to think about these things. And so I think when we're talking about what good GI planning looks like in 2026, I think looking further afield and looking at as many different examples as possible is a really good idea. So this is in Canary Wharf. It's called, I think, called Eden Park. And I went there quite recently, and I'm not the biggest fan of Canary Wharf. If you try and cycle around it, it's quite difficult. But this was a place where you've got water, you've got biodiversity, you've got sculpture, you've got the reflection, you've got the sky, it was a sunny day. It felt very calm. It felt very different to the hustle and bustle of Canary Wharf Station. And it's in an incredibly high density area. So if we're thinking about Asian context, these are all things to consider. And then, of course, we've things that GI provides those affordances and opportunities to support families, to support multi-generational health, well-being, social interaction, but also to support economic development, access to nature, and all these things that we potentially take for granted if a city functions. And just again, for transparency, the Olympic Park in London, I think you probably all know that. When this was first being developed, I was a true hater of this project. I thought £9 billion for what I've always called a big sports day was a waste of money. I went on one of the local trips when they were building it, and I was like, right, I was wrong. I was so wrong. And my kids have spent a lot of time in that park because I like it. And I like it because it's doing so many different things that every time you go, you find something new. You find the wet woodland, which you might not have seen before. You might walk up into Hackney Marshes and the football pitches. Great cheap cafe, like £1.50 for a cup of tea in zone 3 of London, but £1.50, and it's a nice cup of tea. And of course, there's West Ham there, so that's different. But it does all these things collectively. So good master planning, good forethought, and bringing nature into the conversation straight away. Which leads us to this picture. And it is my favorite picture I've ever taken. 2014, Suzhou Park in Suzhou. So just about half an hour from Shanghai. And I'm there with a guy called Professor Bing Chen, who works at the XJTLU, so Jianzhou Tong Liverpool University in Suzhou. And he's showing me around the parks because we're talking about landscape and stuff. And we come across this scene, and I am absolutely bamboozled by what's going on. Because there's the lady in the grey tabard there with a microphone singing. She's doing karaoke. And all these people are her friends. And they come to the park to listen to her sing in the afternoon. And people are clapping, people are dancing. And it's amazing. This is my thing. I still do this every time I talk. It's amazing because this is not an English park. This might happen in London. Probably. Does it happen in Oxford? Do you have people doing karaoke in the park? It's such a culturally appropriate thing to do. The same as dancing, doing your calisthenics, uncles and aunties running really slowly while gossiping. India's the same for that one. It's quite funny. But it really hit home the fact that a space that I know, a park, I know what parks are different. And so if we look at parks as a combination of different components that are for people, that are contextually specific, that offer lots of different social, economic, and environmental functions, and that are there to do climate change resilience ideas, that are there for community well-being and interaction, then these notions of GI as multifunctional, access to nature, connective, integrated in terms of what they do, it makes sense. So that aspatiality really works. And this lady still makes me smile now. But if we go and look across different ideas or different locations in East and Southeast Asia, we see that these things are common. It's just that we're not necessarily using the same terminology. And just a couple of examples here from Singapore and from China, both illustrating what I would consider to be quite a similar thing, a progression of thinking around green infrastructure and GI projects, policy and action, but done in very different ways. I think the post-independence from the United Kingdom, then post-independence from Malaysia that Singapore had really set a tone for, we're going to be Singapore, what's our identity going to be? As an island state that doesn't have enough water, enough food, enough electricity, it kind of needs to think differently. And from day one, green space planning, strategic green space planning, national tree planting days every day from the late 1960s onwards, the green space, the garden city plans that have been regenerated and regenerated to make Singapore a city in a garden, not a garden in a city. And that long-term understanding that Singapore needs to think about nature and people buy into it. Now, there's always conversations about that soft authoritarianism from the Singaporean government that everyone buys into because they know they'll be looked after, but actually don't really have a choice. So is it actually consultative? Is it really for everybody? Or is it a bit top-down, hand on people's backs? And I think it's both of those things, actually. I think that is very clearly there, but people buy into that mentality because they know jobs, hospitals, schools, housing will be provided. But they also see that when things aren't working, they get fixed. So the 2006 Active Beautiful Clean Waters Programme and the development of the Bishang Ang Mo Kio Park, where they took a 25-meter wide concrete drainage channel and renaturalized it as a floodplain, making it one of the most interesting, busiest and diverse parks in the center of the island, shows that they have a commitment to deliver on these things. So what Singapore shows to me is that despite the potential problems of the top-down structure, Delivery is well managed, it's well delivered, and they are trying to work towards being more self-sufficient, although I still don't believe that they can be because they're an island state. We compare that to China. Again, a top-down process, maybe slightly different in terms of the reach and the authority and the ability to be more structured. But from the 1980s onwards, you see this cycle of 5-year plans. You see the cycle of the new project, the new mandate being put forward, be it the National Civilized City, the National Garden City, the Healthy City, the Eco City, the National Forest. Pick your word. We've got lots of words to choose from. And hopefully what you notice is that it's every 3-4 years they get changed. So they move on to the next big thing. Singapore retains trees, garden cities, green planning. China, eco, new, civilized, forest, sponge cities ever so often. And I think this is both a problem and a benefit in China, that it allows them to test things and to get something new, to test it again. But it also suggests that there's a lack of confidence in what's going on because they're not necessarily maintaining the same ideas over and over again. Until we get to 2004 with the National Forest Cities, which is still in place, and 2014 with sponge cities. So sponge cities in particular were first raised in 2012 and 2013. 32 sites were chosen over two different periods, 16 and 16. And they went for the first tranche of places for those not Shanghai, Beijing cities, the ones further down. And it's now 12 years old, that policy. They're still delivering it and they're exporting those ideas to the rest of the world. China is the home of water management for GI because they took in all that knowledge, they worked out how to do it at scale, then how to do it at the local and the strategic, and then they exported it and sold it back to the West. And I think that's really interesting because whilst everything else keeps cycling through in different names, Sponge Cities is still the one that gets the president talking about things. It's still in the media. It's still very much a clear policy mandate. And given that most other things change every 3 to 4 years, I think that tells you a lot about the political currency that Sponge Cities have. So again, very top down, but in a very different way. But if we move forward and look at somewhere like Seoul in South Korea, we see green infrastructure being used in a different way. It's still promoting ideas of connectivity, multifunctionality, but it's also thinking about regeneration and the repurposing of existing hard physical infrastructure for greening. And what I think is really, really important about Seoul is that these ideas were not popular with many people when they were first proposed. The mayor of the city first came up with the idea. So every time I talk about this, I realize that my Korean pronunciation is worse than my Chinese pronunciation. So I'm not going to say this. I'm going to point to this picture here, the stream restoration. I think I know how to say it, but I always say it wrong. A 5-6 kilometer buried river in the city that was daylighted. To have the goal, to have the vision to go, we're going to daylight this and make it one of the most popular places in Seoul and make it a destination internationally because it's this place that people can go and sit down and relax. It's offering climate change adaptation. It's offering habitat. When I was there, I saw a stork and a crane just sat in the river. So offering that urban biodiversity and bringing that neighborhood up with something that can help it prosper. The Solio 7017 is another example. It's a former highway that links it goes over or next to the main Seoul Central Station. If you've ever been to Seoul and tried to come out the station and cross the road, quite difficult. There's a number of lanes of traffic and buses, and you feel you're going to die. Go up onto the roof, you've got this, and it takes you over the traffic down to street level. So it's at grade. So it's accessible. It's connective. It goes to 3 different parts of the city. And it's got the National Arboretum there as well. All these planters have different tree species showcasing the ecology of South Korea. So it's educational as well as being functional. And it's a lot cheaper than knocking down that freeway. And again, a lot of people were like, why are you doing this? It's stupid, get rid of it. But this and the other 2, Forest Park and the Street Park at the bottom, are all repurposing former industrial infrastructure. So the 2 on the right are predominantly using former rail tracks and rail yards things that we've seen in Paris, things that we've seen in New York, things that we now see across the world, because those spaces are small, they're quite narrow, but they are linear, so they offer those spaces. And the two on the right are really interesting because they're in between main transit stops, big subway and train stations. They're near 2 or 3 universities. They're near bars and restaurants and housing. So they're providing an additional resource. So they're multifunctional. And a lot of this was done because there was political support, but there's also an awareness that these spaces would just be left unless something happened with them. I think, again, coming back to some of the ideas from the UK in the 1990s community forestry, it was that rethinking these derelict places as places of meaning and of value. And this is just done in a far more visible and landscape architecture scale. And then if you move on to Japan, I think Japan's interesting because it retains the tradition. It retains that understanding of nature as part of the cultural value of the country, either through things like Shinrin-yoku, so forest bathing, the cherry blossom viewings, the sakura that you have across the island, particularly in Kyoto, and the hanami, the flower viewing, that link to place being very ordered and very managed, and that it's a cultural phenomenon to go and to have your pictures with the cherry blossoms. But what I think we also see in Japan is a real blending of the tradition and the modern. So the Hojo Garden, the Abbott's Garden in Kyoto, is one of those places. It's a classic Japanese Zen garden, and it doesn't look like much until you start to read about how the form and the structure, how the link between people, the celestial, and the land are all part of this understanding of Chinese and Japanese sort of spirituality, and how that kind of conforms with the way in which parks and green spaces looked at within Japanese planning. And then you get something like the Koniguchi Komigawa Park, which is a 16-kilometer bit of the river in the east of Kyoto, which is a greenway, it's a cycleway, it's a biodiverse habitat, it's a floodplain, and it's a disaster refuge area. So if there's ever another big earthquake, people are told to go by the river because it's far enough away from the buildings. So you have this sense of that relationship between people and nature in Japan, which is very formal, very structured, but also very practical in terms of how we think about the future. And I think, again, that draws on these ideas of Howard, of Olmsted, that we're sharing ideas and they transfer across different locations. And so if we're thinking about what drives investment in GI and how we can evaluate success, I think we can go standing these places. This is an October day in 2023. It was about 32 degrees and it was about 25 degrees on that canyon. It was brilliant. But it was used by hundreds of, if not thousands of people when I was there. And it was a Wednesday afternoon. So it's succeeding in many ways. But if we're thinking about things in a more practical and sort of planning way, then there's a whole set of different political and economic drivers. There's ideas around form, function, and design. There's things around ecological and climatic influence we need to talk about, as well as those cultural understandings of place. And again, I think all these are contextual to the location. But what I do think as well is that they map nicely onto different elements and different principles that we spoke about at the start. So where we have successful GI work around the world, there's been strong political support. The Olympic Park in London, Ken Livingstone, Boris Johnson, and so on. There's that visibility and prestige. So the High Line in New York, let's get the wow factor in there. Looking at regeneration, we talked about solar as part of that. And the economic value of green infrastructure is really key here. I did a lot of work a few years ago when I worked at the University of Sheffield, trying to value street trees. And it's really hard, as many of you will probably know, because you're trying to come up with a finite number for something which is intangible in many ways. And the reason I thought it was difficult, because it's like, if we get this number wrong, the council will never believe us again, because they need something definite. So there's that tolerances that we have to play with. But I think what we do see, and I think some of your colleagues here with some of their indexes are showing, is that greener, more sustainable, more livable, more walkable cities are more prosperous. Zurich, Stockholm, Vancouver, they might all be unaffordable to live there, but they all have these things, they all work. So the economic value is key. That links back into those political ideas. But then we also need to talk about quality, quantity, provision, access, who has what and how it works, and the diversity of that. And I think we've done both very well and incredibly poorly at managing those ideas around equity in some of these places. But that then leads us to think about design, scale, preferences, and what people actually want and what will work in a given location. What will work in Oxford will probably not work in Bristol. What will work in Manchester will not work in Liverpool, despite being 32 miles away from each other. So we have to think contextually. Of course, we have climate resilience and climate preparedness going on there. But I think also one of this bottom right box, these cultural norms and architectures and preferences is key. It's the old lady singing in the park. It's the way in which we all engage with those spaces around us. It's the way in which we valorize national parks versus our local park. And I think if we understand these cultural norms about place, we can then design in the most appropriate form of green infrastructure to support that. And so just to finish off, I think we can look at GI as a traveling concept. It travels across the world. It's aspatial, and these principles and these elements can be applied anywhere. And that's a benefit because it means we can have conversations around the world, but also it adds a level of vagueness, so it's sometimes problematic. But also, if we look at GI as a boundary object and look at it as something which brings disciplines together, I think that's key. Because my father, he works in construction, he hates planners. Our dinners are really fun. Like normally moans about the council and what they won't let him do, because he won't use the right language. He's adversarial rather than welcoming. And I think GI as a boundary is a welcoming place to be. Tree folks, ecologists, planners can all talk the same language because they're all talking about the same thing, and we can start to moderate some of that language. And I think we see that with the ways in which Singapore, for example, has had this intergenerational understanding of the value of nature, and it brings ideas from other parts of the world and makes them their own. It makes them Singaporean. And all these things, I think, are part of this conversation to go, the principles and the elements can be applied elsewhere. So just to finish up, I think this is a really nice product. A flower you plant may not necessarily bloom, but the seed of a tree you happen to drop may grow into a forest. And I think GI is a seed that was dropped by a lot of people in a lot of places. And it works in those places because people have taken on board modernity and tradition, the old and the new, the cost and the benefits, issues about density and access, and made it locally contextual. If we just try to enforce an idea from one place to another, and I'm thinking in the Middle East in the 1990s and all the new water resilient cities, ideas from elsewhere just transplanted into a desert, it doesn't work. But that organic nature of growth in knowledge, expertise, and in people, I think is really key. Because then it allows us to bring in all this local indigenous knowledge, but it allows us to draw on best practice and ideas from elsewhere as well. So thank you all for listening. This last picture, this is the Beijing Forest Park, the top of the Beijing Olympic Park in Beijing. And what's amazing, this was taken last October, and I was there. I was actually wearing this jacket. And it was deadly silent. It's in the middle of the city, and it's deadly silent. And I saw nobody for about 10 minutes. And it just felt amazing to be in nature on my own. It was quite cold, so it felt quite nice. Like you felt quite invigorated. And then you walk back around to the path and you see the old ladies dancing. You see the kids there doing their schoolwork. You see the aunties and uncles pretending to run and gossiping, and it becomes China again. But this one site has that ability to have solitude and tranquility and action, because the design is for people, for nature, and for place. So thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you to the department, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks very much for that. We'll open up to questions now. Just to kick off, you mentioned that England, while being conceptually at the forefront of this, is lagging behind the devolved nations. What is the reason for that? What's holding England back?
I think it's central government. I think the devolved powers that the Scottish and the Welsh executive has, in the same way that the devolved regions in the northwest, so Manchester or Liverpool, they've really taken on board these ideas more, and they're not constrained by the politics of Westminster all fighting each other. So I think the SNP, Plaid Cymru, have been really quite progressive in terms of their understanding that nature is a valuable asset to those places, whereas the Conservatives, Labour, Reform, unfortunately, from my perspective, seem to think that nature is something to benefit from and commercialise. So I think that's part of it, that they've never got round to thinking this is actually important enough to do something, even though we have legislation that says you should be doing stuff. Whereas I think Scotland and Wales have gone, no, we recognise this is important. And particularly with the national parks in Wales and Scotland, they are such a part of their economic focus that they really see the value of maintaining that and managing it. Whereas I think in England, we don't always see that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we can open up to.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for the talk. I really appreciated it, and all of the case studies in particular that you brought up. So one thing in my research around green infrastructure as well is that I've come across a lot is, normative calls for multifunctionality, but then often a lack of multiple benefits being delivered in practice. Mind you, the case studies you gave there seem to show the opposite, which is really nice to see. But what I find happens in a lot of these cases is there's a lack of coordination or collaboration, particularly between municipal departments, which limits the amount of multiple benefits that these projects can deliver. And I wanted to ask what you think are the main barriers and perhaps the main success factors in improving multifunctionality, and whether that's things like shared mission approaches or shared narratives between departments, if it's different governance arrangements or task forces, committees to get different departments working together. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on how do we get more cross-sectoral collaboration in this space.
Thank you. It's a really astute observation. It's something that I'm a glass half full kind of guy, so I show the good stuff. When I'm teaching, I badmouth a lot of that stuff quite a lot, particularly Singapore quite a lot, to be honest. I think it comes down to people. So I think collaboration is something that in the UK we are legally required to do. Cooperation between departments and between local authorities. But to get to do that, people need to agree on stuff. And there's so much siloed mentality and workload capacity in many ways in planning in the UK that it doesn't always happen. Where I see things working positively is where individuals are going above and beyond. So one example would be the Bristol, Bath and North Somerset region, the Baines region. They've done a lot of work on green infrastructure, and it's come down to individual officers championing this work and then elevating it up through committee. Now, that both is and isn't their job, because they're there to be planners, but they also know that this is important, so they've tried to put it on the political agenda. And it's been successful, but that doesn't happen everywhere. In any local authority, transport planners are just a pain. They think that they're right, they have very technical solutions, they don't like listening to the tree people. Trees are bad, transport good. And so some of those siloed thinking are really hard to break down, particularly when it's older white males in Britain who have been planners forever and know best. The my dad kind of scenario. I think where we see positives, we see an alignment of the goals that you want to find, an alignment of we've got an issue, say in Bangkok in Thailand, surface water flooding. It has to be dealt with because the city can't cope. And so thinking between universities, between the municipality, between water folks, engineers, I think the severity of that issue allows you to then say, this needs to be dealt with. But it's a city by city, it's a municipality by municipality, it's a person from person perspective. And somewhere like London, I think, is an example where it works and it doesn't work. The GLA, when they had Peter Massini and now they've got Abby Crisotomo, both excellent GI advocates. And their job is to balance and negotiate between developers, boroughs, the GLA, the mayor, the king, and all these things to try and find a positive. And it doesn't always work. But there's that resilience in those people to keep trying. And so you've got people who are real advocates for what we do. There are people who are, it's their job, but they're resilient in terms of how they do it. And I think the examples where it's been positive, it's that kind of mentality that keep pushing forward. Where it doesn't work, I think there's a lack of support upstairs. There's a lack of support at the coalface, and the problems might seem too big. How do you tackle climate change? How do you tackle inequality in provision of green space? How do you tackle obesity or mental health issues in a city centre if you can't physically change it? So I think there's a lot of people who are very run down and very burnt out about trying to do these things. But there's always bright sparks. There's always people who are willing to push it forward. And I think those people are worth their weight in gold. But it doesn't happen everywhere. A lot of the examples in China, there's like one person saying yes and the whole system saying no, so it doesn't happen. In Japan, there's a collectivization, but if it's not going to work, people will subtly say no. But I think collaboration is a good start. Corroboration is great, but it needs to come from people or from very strong political leadership. You've got a mayor or a president who says, this is what we do, you kind of have to do it. And that can work. Or with some parts of the world, maybe it doesn't work at all.
Thanks, really interesting talk. You were just mentioning mayors, and I wondered if you have any thoughts about opportunities for green infrastructure with the move to strategic authorities and more mayors at the regional level.
I live in a city with a combined authority and a mayor. I think it's wonderful. I think one of my big bugbears, along with the NPPF, is the dismantling of regional policy in England. When I first started my academic career, we had regional spatial strategies, which allowed areas, so the northwest and northeast, to work in collaboration, what you were just asking about. And it worked really well. They were difficult. The regional development agencies were difficult beasts to work with, but they thought about those bigger picture ideas. They thought about housing and transport and health and education at a regional scale to ensure that there was parity, or at least attempts of parity, across those areas. And because of that, you had almost a mayoral figure as the head of the RDA. And I think whilst there was a lot of resentment from central government specifically, but from some local governments being told what to do, it allowed a collectivization of understanding of GI and other things to work. Where we have metro mayors, Liverpool, Manchester, not Leeds and Sheffield, that's not quite happened, but other places, I think again there's a collective coming together of knowledge and expertise, and I think they are really, really essential for getting bigger things done. If it's about police, it's about education, about nature, because if you ask a local authority to develop a nature recovery strategy, they'll say we haven't got the time, the personnel, or the money. But as a collective body of entities, so in Manchester it's 10 different local authorities, they do have that authority. They have a leader saying this is what we're doing. And so I think they're incredibly useful. London, I think, proves that. I think Paris and the Metro Mayor there proves it. Even in places in Southeast Asia, Bangkok, well, the mayor there is pushing, I think, an environmental agenda. I think, though, if they're ineffectual or there's no buy-in, so the Leeds Sheffield thing, the Birmingham one seems to work and not work at times. Bristol goes up and down in how it works. I think it can be problematic. But we've got Andy Burnham at the moment. Fingers crossed he stays. And his work on mobility and transport has been really fantastic because it's addressing a core issue across the whole of Greater Manchester. So I think they can be really useful if they've got their head in the right place. But if they're not good, then the whole thing is going to fall down very quickly, because how do you trust in the system if the system's screwing you over or it's not delivering on stuff? So I'm all for metro mayors. I'm really for regional planning as well. So I'm quite happy it's coming back in a way.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. I really appreciate the like global insights of all the green places you've been to. And I think one thing that struck me was this idea of access and how in some places you get like overt exclusive access. Like in New York City, there's Central Park that's open to the public, but to go to like a local neighborhood park, it's gated off. Or in Oxford, it's a little bit more subtle, but there's so much like green space in the city that you only get to behind the walls of a college. And I was wondering if you had any insights on like how that kind of culture cultural perception of access influences planning and influences green infrastructure and like who gets to
Academically, a
go.
lot. Practically, less so. My example would be central London and the inner London boroughs, where you have diverse populations of different socio-demographic groups, different ethnicities, different age groups, some living in social housing, some living in private housing. And the disparity between the quality and the provision of any kind of open space, never mind green infrastructure in those places, is really dramatic. Even within a borough in London, you see nothing to a massive public park. I think planners are aware of this. I think some planners really do care and some planners don't care. I think academics care a lot. There's a whole literature, people like Alessandro Rigolon, Laurie Nesbitt, Isabella Angelowski, working on these ideas now. I think it's quite difficult to break down some of the structural barriers to dealing with it because urban form is as it is. So developing new places, you're now designing in to hopefully make it more inclusive, but you're balancing public versus private investment. With public investment, it's a must. With private investment, it's definitely not. So if you're buying a private development, you might want your gated garden and for everybody else to go away. Not the same with the college system, but your college is very internalized. And if cities want development, they do tend to allow that to happen. But I think there definitely is a recognition that there's an inequality in provision of quality and quantity. There are very systematic areas where you see people have been excluded. There's a lot of discussion around the Northwest in Oldham and Rochdale, for example, around a very high South Asian community being located in areas of poor provision of green space. It's a historical thing. You'd have the redlining ideas in the US. And I think we're starting to disassemble those mentalities, but we're still far, far away from being anywhere near inclusive. I think when we look at new master plans, gates and fences are less visible. Using trees as screening has become more popular, but there's safety issues there. So you've got a whole host of structural issues around, is planning racist? And it's like, probably yes, still in many places, but I think it is getting better. Getting better at not being racist rather than getting more racist. just to clarify that. But I think there are still problems with working with an existing urban form and how you try and dismantle some of those, particularly those fences, because a lot of people like them. Somewhere like Belfast, for example, where division is through a different means, people like fences, they like barriers because it's safety, it's an identity, it's a known territory, it's ours versus theirs. And Belfast City Council is trying to take down the peace walls, and a lot of people are not happy, and they're still there, even though they could have come down probably 10 years ago. So I think it's a really interesting area of this study. It's probably, along with climate change, the most important area we're dealing with. But it's also the most structurally problematic because of how cities function and how you try and plan for the future whilst breaking down these physical barriers of the past.
Maybe one of the last questions. And thanks so much for coming in. Just at advertisement, we also recorded a podcast for Liverpool Center, and you can hear more about the questions we asked Ian about his amazing work on the green infrastructure internationally and here. Okay, so there's one last question. Maybe I should shut up because today I asked too many questions for you. But you probably know at the end of last year, there was this initiative about forest cities. And that was ever since the Milton Keys, the future town built in 1960s. So it's like 50 years later. Finally, UK gonna do something. England gonna do something bigger-ish. And the location they choose is outskirts of Cambridge, isn't it? And that's where that's gonna happen. So I think I've been asked you, and you already mentioned all the kind of bigger scale green infrastructure plan or the green cities, eco cities happen in Asia, and sort of like feedback to when England's structure is really fragmented. And is this kind of the reflection as in now, okay, after 50 years, we're gonna do something bigger now. And what do you potentially gonna think about this?
I don't think they're bigger. I think all the conversations around nature towns and cities and new towns, they're all quite small. They're not going to fix this 1.5 million homes that the government keeps talking about. They're all going to be 20 to 40,000 people. And personally, they're all in the wrong place. Like one between Oxford and Cambridge, do you really want that? The Greenbelt people might get involved with this. The CPRE will definitely get involved. The one in near Chester in the northwest seems to be in a really odd place where there's no transport link. So being sustainable doesn't seem to be at the heart of these ideas. Everybody I worked with was like, what methodology did they use to pick these places? And everyone looked through the document and went, there's no methodology in here. So I think there were some political conversations going on. I really don't think they're going to work, actually. I think they're too small, they're in the wrong place, and they're not necessarily thinking big enough. So England and the UK is not China. We're not going to build a 150,000 home extension on the edge of Shanghai because it would never happen and we'd make it poor. But building a new town in the middle of nowhere and then having to build a spur line out to it to make it work isn't going to work either. I think all governments come up with their new idea, and all governments think that they've solved the problem. This one, despite all the promotion and all the work being put in by government, they're bringing in people to help design the program now, so that's brilliant. But I can't see how they're going to alleviate the housing issues or the transport issues or climate issues, given where they are. One's on a floodplain, and again, it's like if you ask, any of you, you'd go, don't build it on a floodplain. If you ask any planner, they'd be like, you can't build it there. You ask the Environment Agency, they tell you not to build it there. And yet we're going to do it. It's great that they're having these conversations. It's great that they want to do something good. They want to reinvent Ebenezer Howard rather than transport it back from China. I think it's more of a TCPA type job. But I really can't see how the problems that we have in housing or environmental management are going to be solved by bespoke little places like this, in the same way that Poundbury did not solve a housing crisis 20 years ago. So we'll see what happens. I might be wrong. I was wrong about the Olympic Park, so I could be wrong about this.
You got time? One more question.
There's a couple online as well.
Here we can. Actually, well, I'll ask one while I look at the ones online. Well, I was thinking particularly about the focus you had on Asian cities and the future of Asian cities, and I'm wondering how, in terms of global influence, thinking about other regions of the world like Africa, and are they looking to Asia for inspiration, or are they just still developing an ad hoc style? When we look at the wider world, where is it looking? Where's the future of green infrastructure in cities?
I think Africa is a really interesting example because the influence of China through the Belt and Road Initiative, particularly around key infrastructure and investment via those funds, is really reshaping how land use and land ownership is being changed. I was at a really interesting talk the other day by a guy called Seth Schindler, who works with us at Manchester, and he was talking about the long-term problems that this might create about who owns Ghana. Is it the Ghanaians or is it the Chinese? Those kind of things. I think African cities are looking internally. They're looking at their own indigenous knowledge, particularly around land management, afforestation and water management, for example. I think they're also looking at European academics and European agencies to work with them, because unfortunately the colonial links are still there. So you've got a lot of people from French universities from the UK working in these places as well, and even Germany. And so you see those ideas being workshopped, being discussed between planners and academics, both locally and internationally. And I think so there's a link between Europe and Africa. I don't yet see a link between Japanese or Chinese or Malaysian academics in Africa from the literature. There are small numbers of people working on, tend to do big data and more data-driven analyses, but nothing that seems to be more on the ground planning focused. It might happen, depending on how the Chinese continue to fund infrastructure over there, but it might not. What I would hope is that African academics go their own way. They don't need Europeans, to be honest. They're far better at understanding locality than we are. In the same way that I would say that folks in South Asia, in Pakistan or Bangladesh particularly, know what water management looks like and do it better than the Europeans do. So hopefully there'll be far more investment into home universities rather than importing in expertise from elsewhere. But I think it's a bit of a long-term goal rather than something immediate.
Okay, great. There are a couple of online questions. I'll give them quickly, maybe quick answers so we don't hold people back from drinks too long. One's from Professor Steve Newman. Why have planners forgotten about the spatial integration of agriculture, food production in cities? This was central to Howard's vision and of 100% relevance today.
He's picked the one bugbear I have with the whole GI debate about urban agriculture. In the UK, I think we have a very decentralized view of agriculture versus planning. As Wendy and I were talking about earlier on, the way that agriculture is classified is agriculture, and it sits in its own little silo. I think issues of food security are really important, particularly linked to environmental productivity and capacity. I think it is going to be an increasing conversation because as the UK climate changes more dramatically, we might have different growing seasons, might have different produce. I think a lot of planners find it difficult to deal with agriculture because farmers are quite difficult people. I grew up in a rural area of North Lincolnshire. A lot of my mates' families are farmers, and they're all big burly men who shout at everybody else because we've got a beard, that kind of stuff. But I think there will need to be a conversation, and I think micro-scale urban agriculture is not the answer. I think those acupuncture type, here's my thing of vegetables, here's my herb garden. They're good individually, but they're not going to make you a loaf of bread or get you some milk. So I think it's something that is largely ignored. I think the agricultural sector and the way it talks to government is a very different conversation to these things. But productivity and capacity to maintain productivity, I think, is going to become more and more critical as the climate changes.
Great. And one final question from Alexander Schosel. What are you hopeful for in terms of pathways of integrating and financing green infrastructure in cities? End on a high note.
I am relatively optimistic compared to where we were 15 years ago. The work we did at Sheffield really felt like a bit of a kicking off point for conversations around greening and economics, because it wasn't conventional environmental economics. It was more about the value of something to an individual and that pounds and pence rather than big numbers. One thing that I think we are seeing is the private sector, for better or for worse, is starting to engage with these conversations. A few years ago, I was talking to a charity called Thames 21 in London. They're a water-based charity, lots of conservation work. And a lot of their clients were law firms, finance firms, because they were doing their corporate social responsibility and they wanted to get their staff out to give something back. And whilst you might say, oh, super, their staff are helping, or, oh, really, they're just ticking a box, I think there is a growing appreciation that the carbon footprints and the way in which companies monopolize places, they have to give something back. So I think there are cities, and probably Asian cities probably do this better because they have that dialogue with private, and it's about people and it's about relationships rather than structures that we have in the UK. I think there's opportunities there. I don't think, and I really don't think this, that communities and individuals should be placed the burden of doing this. We all pay taxes. We shouldn't have to then do it ourselves. If we want to be in friends groups, brilliant, want to do conservation work, fantastic, but we shouldn't be the custodians of somewhere because government won't pay. There needs to be a different mechanism. And I think that, there was work by Sean Bell in Exeter a few years ago, looked at all the different mechanisms from the very technical, the green bonds kind of stuff, all the way into community partnerships. And I think there's lots of opportunity, but we're somewhat reluctant to try new things in case they go wrong, because no one wants to be to blame for something not working. But I'm relatively optimistic that we're not just going to look to government anymore, and we'll be looking to a whole series of different pots of funding.
Great, thank you. And I think we can wrap up there. So thank you for loads of ideas. That's stimulating.